This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. K-State beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff starts today's show by discussing cattle heat stress. He says it is vital that cattle have time to cool off at night to dissipate heat from the day. Today's show continues with A.J. Tarpoff, K-State beef veterinarian, as he continues the conversation about reducing heat stress for cattle. We are also joined by Kansas Livestock Association's Scarlett Hagins with a decision from the Sackett versus EPA Supreme Court Case. Finishing today's show is K-State Extension Horticulture Agent for Sedgwick County, Matthew McKernan, with 6 ways to drought-proof a Kansas landscape. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today, and as the temperatures continue to rise, heat stress in cattle becomes something that needs to be talked about, and to do it is K-State beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff. A.J., thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure to be in.
So before we get started on talking about all the things to mitigate and what causes heat stress, what is heat stress?
Yeah, down to, I like to simplify everything. What is heat stress? You know, when you walk out the front door and you start sweating and you try to work, you try to do anything, and it's just so hot, it's uncomfortable, right? And I think down to the basics of it is heat stress is environmental discomfort for whatever animal or species. It's environmental discomfort that you have to change behavior, you have to modify something, you need to cool yourself down, you need to go get in the sprinkler. Well, for cattle, that means I need to dissipate heat, that you've accumulated too much heat, and that, you know, that's not a good thing. I have to change. So to me, that's what heat stress is, that the environmental constraints are such that you need to change something to remain comfortable.
Talking about the environment, what are some factors from the environment that impact cattle specifically?
So, you know, heat stress is nothing new. The cattle industry has been dealing with heat stress and trying to mitigate the impacts of heat stress for as long as we've raised cattle. And now, thankfully, cattle they're an amazing animal. They're adaptable. They can get used to the temperatures and different environmental extremes. It just takes time to adapt. Now, the environmental issues that we run into are a multitude of different things. It's not just temperature, but it's temperature, humidity, wind speed, and solar radiation. Those 4 key factors put together really has the overall impact of what the animal comfort level is in any given scenario. And that's also true for cold stress as well. So heat or cold, those are the 4 key factors.
You mentioned before this, cattle have to cool at night.
So they do. So, you know, what makes cattle so special is, in my opinion, is that, you know, they don't sweat. They sweat a little bit, but it's at a much lower amount than other species. So to compare to people, cattle only, have the capabilities of sweating like 10% as much as what people are. And it's usually, you know, in between their legs and things like that. So that cooling mechanism is very inefficient. Cattle's main cooling mechanism is through respiratory evaporation. So they begin to pant, almost like a dog. A dog, you know, is out running around and it lays down and it pants. The increase in blood flow to its tongue, they're able to blow that out through, you know, the vapors that are coming from the lungs as well as the blood flow within the tongue itself. So they increase respiratory rate, they cool themselves. They're also kind of, what either can help or hurt is the environmental areas. Right, so they'll naturally, cattle will find shaded areas or find areas that are on top of a mound where they can catch a cool breeze. And all of a sudden, we have convection cooling that breeze is actually pulling off some of the heat load from them. Now, during here in the spring or coming up into the summer months, what we run into is, well, it's just going to be hot and sunny all day, and that's okay. Cattle have the capability to be able to, we call it heat load, that they will accumulate heat during the daytime hours until the nighttime cooling hours, and it takes about 4 to 6 hours, usually in midnight and on, that those nighttime cooling hours where the temperature drops, we have a little bit of a breeze, that they can dissipate all that heat from the previous day. and they just start fresh the next day, and they're ready to go. Usually we don't have heat stress issues until day 2 or 3 if we don't have some of those nighttime cooling scenarios.
So talking about cooling, I know my dog at home has a special air vent that he goes and lays on top of to get himself cooled down. We can't just put air conditioners everywhere for big feedlots. So what are some different ways that you can help cattle not create as much heat for themselves?
Yeah, so heat stress mitigation. And, heat stress mitigation, I think it all begins with management. How we handle these animals, when we move these animals, if we have to process them and they're new on arrival, or say we have to ship and we're shipping some of those animals. Making sure that we aren't handling these animals, increasing their body temperatures during the heat of the day. If we need to process, if we need to move pens, if we need to ship animals, we need to try to have that wrapped up by about 10 a.m. Okay, if we can do that, we can let them settle, they can cool themselves, and so we aren't adding to some of that heat load issue during the heat of the day. 2, we can possibly modify some things with the rations, with our nutrition. There's a concept known as the heat of fermentation. So remember, we don't feed cattle, we feed the rumen microbes. So these microbes, these bacteria, they break down the feedstuffs. Well, that comes at a cost, and one of those costs is it releases heat. So that really helps us during the winter months whenever we're feeding cattle, because they kind of have their own heat generator to keep them warm. Well, during the summer months, that's counterproductive. So we want to make sure that whatever ration, whatever feeds that we're feeding, they're easily digestible. Okay, because the easier digestible feedstuffs don't produce as much heat of fermentation. We want to make sure that we might actually change some of our feed timing. So the heat of fermentation maximizes about 4 hours after we feed. So to make sure we aren't building up too much heat during the day, we may deliver most of our daily feed in the evening hours to make sure that heat of fermentation is happening overnight so we don't have compounding effects. So those are 2 strategies on the feed side, but also number 1 is water. Okay. So when the temperatures rise from about 70 to 90 degrees, the water consumption and the water needs increase by 2 times. Okay, so if they're consuming 8 gallons of water a day, that can jump to 16 gallons. And that can happen really quick. So cattle use that extra water. They consume that to help cool themselves. And it's a big driver to make sure that they maintain what we call homeostasis, or regular body temperature. So prepare now. Before some of these heat events, I know folks that have automatic waters, usually they have a summertime level and a wintertime level. Get out there and make sure that they are at the maximum capacity, making sure we have enough. If you're worried about water tank capacity and availability, plan ahead. Is there an opportunity to think outside of the box to increase water availability? Do we need to add in some extra water? Right? Is the water, do we have, check the pumps, making sure that we have plenty of flow to make sure that if they're going to be consuming a lot, we need plenty of it and in enough volume for all those animals to consume it. So plan ahead for water, possibly come up with some ideas and work with your nutritionists and veterinarians to figure out, do we need to change anything nutritionally or management-wise? But that's management. I guess the other side of heat stress mitigation is environmental. And environmental is what we often focus on as well. And it comes down to some of the basics. We want to improve airflow. We want to make sure that these animals are comfortable in their given environment. Now, pasture animals, we have less of a concern with heat stress. Okay, they naturally find some of those key areas of the pasture, whether it's on the side of a hill that just has a natural flow of air where they're getting a good cooling breeze. Some of the low-lying areas that are shaded, they may utilize some of those areas. They may go stand in a pond. So they have those options. When we have animals in confinement, it's up to us to make sure that we both construct these pens correctly. They have proper drainage so we don't increase humidity, but also that, maybe some other tools, and we'll talk about that. So mounds in the center of pens. It's amazing how much that the pen construction, whenever we have mounds, helps with drainage, but it also gives the opportunity that cattle climb to the top of those mounds and they actually catch a breeze that's just a little bit elevated off that pen floor. 2, sprinklers, right? Often folks might utilize sprinklers for dust control. Sprinklers can be used in the feedlot scenario. They're used constantly on the dairy side to wet cattle as they go in and out of the parlors. But on the feedlot side, we usually use them for dust mitigation or in the overnight hours to cool the pen floor. Okay, so we will actually wet the pen floor to allow evaporation to occur, and that evaporation pulls the heat out of that dirt floor. So it's kind of unless we can wet those animals completely, it's counterproductive. But we use them to actually cool the pen, not the cattle themselves. Because keep in mind, during the heat of the day, a pen floor can get upwards to 140 degrees. That's 140.
And you said cooling them overnight, putting water, not during the day.
Yeah, so that what we find is we want big water droplets. And if we do it during the heat of the day, we can actually increase humidity at the pen level. So the microclimate of the pen itself, we don't want to increase humidity when we want it dry. We want breezes going through. If we increase humidity, it makes it more difficult for those cattle to dissipate heat. So we usually want to have big water droplets, wet the pen floor to allow evaporation in the cooling overnight hours or the very early morning hours to make sure that we are cooling that pen completely from the day before. So those, it's kind of every day is its own series of events.
That was Kansas State University beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff discussing heat stress in cattle and what causes it and different things that producers could do to reduce it in their herd. When we come back from the break, we're going to be joined once again with A.J. as he continues to discuss what producers could be doing to reduce heat for their herd. He talks about some basic things that producers might have forgotten as we enter into these hot summer months. If you're afraid you're going to miss out on the rest of today's show because you're reaching your destination, you can find it on agtoday.net or on your favorite streaming platform. Once again, that is agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by A.J. Tarpoff. This is Agriculture Today, and we're once again joined by K-State beef veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff as he discusses cattle heat stress. He continues the conversation discussing things that producers could do to help cool down pens.
Other ways that we can cool the pen floor, we can actually use reflective bedding. When we think about straw, think about corn stalks, things like that we can use dry bedding and sprinkle it over that. I understand that comes at a cost. Whatever we put into that pen floor, we usually have to haul out and manure. So I understand that comes at a cost. But we can also reduce that pen floor temperature by 25 degrees just by utilizing a light layer of bedding. Okay, so that increases animal comfort on the pen level, but also reduces the overall stress within that given scenario. And we can use several of these things. We can use sprinklers. We can use bedding. We can make sure that our pens are constructed properly. But sometimes it's the basics. Do we have haystacks that are blocking wind or impeding, wind coming through in operation? If that's true, hey, it's time to move the haystack. Or do you have tall weeds on your perimeter fencing? Well, cutting out those weeds, improving airflow, all of those things seem like small jobs, but they're critical to improve the animal comfort on the operation.
And I know on hot days, I like finding a tree or something and creating some shade for myself. Is that something that if they're in an area where there isn't a shade for them, that producers need to create shade for cattle?
Yeah, so shade is always an option for cattle producers to utilize. And, usually as we go further south, when we get into South Texas and Arizona, shade is a necessity, right? Just the solar radiation is so intense that we need that to be able to produce cattle in those areas. As we come a little bit further east, when we have really high humidity, again, we utilize a lot more shade. Western Kansas is part of the big cattle feeding belt because of the environment that it's most conducive for animal comfort, right? So there are areas of Kansas that absolutely we can see improvement in animal comfort and productivity whenever we utilize shade. Now, the question's always cost, right? If we're going to put in shade, that comes at a cost. What is our return on investment? So over the past 2 years at the beef stocker unit, we actually utilized some shade and did some shade research, looking at both limit feeding a high density, highly digestible ration, and shade or no shade. So we had looked at this over 2 years to make sure we had repeatable results, and we absolutely did. And what we found is, regardless of how you feed animals, we can reduce the impacts of the solar radiation, increasing comfort. We reduce panting scores. Remember, we talked that cattle actually pant whenever they get hot. We significantly reduce panting scores. We reduce the amount of water that cattle actually need, which water is a critical resource. We can reduce daily intakes by over 1 gallon a day just by utilizing shade. But also, back to the point of why, efficiencies, we improve feed efficiency and increase average daily gain by 7% on average daily gain and 6% on feed efficiency by utilizing shade. So there's an economic return, and those are data points that can be utilized to figure out on your operation, if you increase your efficiencies during the summer months by utilizing shade, how long is it going to take to pay for itself? Okay, so shade's a phenomenal tool if it's available. Structure of them is very important, making sure that one, they're tall enough to allow breezes to come through and we can fit equipment for cleaning underneath. But also, if you're going to set up a big thing of shade somewhere, make sure that we are orienting that in the correct location. Because remember, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. If we actually set up our sunshades east to west, the shade spot never moves. So cattle only congregate in one location. We want to make sure that we set up those shade orientation north and south to make sure that we that shaded spot within a pen moves throughout the day.
You mentioned at the beginning that talk to your nutritionist, talk to your vet. Can you talk about the value of, you have a great wealth of knowledge, AJ, but you're not the person in the local community with that farmer who's built the relationship with Joe who raises 300 cattle?
So every operation is very, very specific. These are options for heat mitigation. Some operations choose to implement several of them. Anything that you do to mitigate heat stress in your animals is going to have an improvement in your overall productivity. Okay, so, your local veterinarian, your local consultants, your local people that understand your operation can give you a more tailored outlook on opportunities if you want to utilize bedding or shade, increase water tank availability. Any of those things that we just discussed could have pay dividends to any operation, but it's trying to find that critical what is practical on your specific operation. And that's where having a good discussion with your veterinarian, your consulting nutritionist, the folks that you go to locally, if they understand what you do and the constraints of your operation, it's more tailored to what will be profitable for you.
So there might be a little bit of cost at the beginning, but producers hopefully can see a return on investment of putting forth effort to reduce heat stress for their cattle.
When we reduce heat stress, we reduce that negative behavior that is associated with heat stress. Usually they drop intake. They're less efficient. All of these negative things, they drink way more water. So now our water bill goes up if you're on rural water. So whenever we mitigate these impacts, all of a sudden we maintain productivity. We increase average daily gain. We increase feed efficiency. We increase the whole system-wide sustainability. The resources going in are more effective at raising a pound of beef.
And so talking about weather, talking about heat, thinking about when you're working your cattle, what's a source that people can do to keep track of what's happening in their area?
Monitoring weather events is something everyone does in agriculture, whether it's waiting for their next rain or trying to plan ahead. One of the great tools that we have available here in the state of Kansas is the Kansas Mesonet. On the Mesonet website, under the agriculture tab, there's an animal comfort index. That animal comfort index is a really neat tool that actually incorporates temperature, humidity, wind speed, and solar radiation to give localized, up-to-date information on what your animals are feeling or what that comfort index is. It's weighted so it can actually, whether it's cold or hot, it works year round, but you can see when your animals may be in stress. You can monitor nighttime cooling from the previous 24 hours. So if you're curious if last night your animals cooled down from the heat of the day, you can jump on the Mesonet website, find your localized weather station, and you can get that information that's readily available. So hopefully some tools into the future. The Mesonet is always upgrading and changing some different things. So utilizing the tools and checking in because there might be some new tools available to help forecast and be able to have a better idea and plan ahead by utilizing that Mesonet site.
And AJ, you mentioned some research you've done on this, and you wrote past articles on heat stress and the shade. So those will be linked in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. AJ, thank you for coming in and sharing your wealth of knowledge on heat stress in cattle. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
That was Kansas State University beef veterinarian AJ Tarpoff. You can find the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. We are now going to be joined by the Kansas Livestock Association's Scarlett Hagins. The Supreme Court recently issued its long-awaited opinion in the Sackett versus EPA case. Scarlett Hagins says this is the court's most recent decision about which water features are subject to federal jurisdiction under the Clean Water Act.
In its unanimous 9-0 holding, the High Court ruled in favor of the Sackett family, finding their wetlands do not fall under federal jurisdiction. NCBA and KLA strongly support this ruling. The court also soundly rejected the contentious significant nexus test. This test has been used to clarify that certain bodies of water, such as tributaries and wetlands, are subject to the Clean Water Act based on their connection to and effect on larger downstream waters that Congress sought to protect when the act was implemented. Instead of the significant nexus test, the majority of the court adopted the continuous surface connection test for determining Clean Water Act jurisdiction for wetlands. Under this standard, wetlands are jurisdictional only when they have a continuous surface connection to bodies that are actual waters of the U.S., so that there is no clear demarcation between waters and wetlands. The majority of justices also found the Clean Water Act limits its jurisdiction to traditional navigable waters and only those relatively permanent standing or continuously flowing bodies of water connected to traditional navigable waters. In practice, this likely means isolated wetlands and other ephemeral features are not subject to federal Clean Water Act permitting requirements. The Supreme Court's decision puts the Biden administration's waters of the U.S. definition, which has a foundation in the significant nexus test, on shaky ground by significantly limiting executive overreach and restoring predictability to the Clean Water Act. It also likely will allow states and other litigants, like NCBA, who previously obtained a preliminary injunction against the rule, to ask the court to immediately vacate the rule. I'm Scarlett Hagins.
Once again, that was Kansas Livestock Association's Scarlett Hagins. We're going to be cutting to a short break, but when we come back, we're going to be joined by K-State Extension horticulture agent from Sedgwick County as he discusses 6 ways to drought-proof a Kansas landscape.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. Drought-tolerant plants for a challenging Kansas landscape was the focus of May's K-State Garden Hour with Extension Horticulture Agent for Sedgwick County, Matthew McKernan, and Central Kansas District Horticulture Agent Jason Graves. McKernan says the biggest thing you can do for drought-proofing your landscape is to select plants that are going to be well adapted, because they'll be able to handle extreme periods of drought and do well once they're established in the landscape.
But it's not only about selecting the right type of plant, it's also selecting plants that are going to be healthy to begin with. And give yourself permission to remove those plants in the landscape that are a high water use, those plants that just seem to droop every single afternoon when they start to get dry during the hot summer months. Tip number 2, following best gardening practices. The first thing we can do is help apply mulch. Not only is it going to help conserve soil moisture, but it's also going to keep the sun and other environmental extremes from having as much of a temperature fluctuation from hots and colds and things like that. We want to use organic mulches, basically plant-based mulches that can break down over time and add back to the soil health and increase the organic matter of your soil. It's also really important to eliminate weeds when we talk about drought-proofing our landscape. If we think about it, weeds are just those undesirable plants in our lawns and landscapes that are competing with the desirable plants for the limited resources that they have. So by eliminating weeds, we can help supply more of the moisture that's available in the soil to our desirable plants. We can also decrease fertilizer use to help increase the drought tolerance of our landscape as well. Fertilizer increases growth in our plants. And so the more our plants grow, the more they are going to need water in order to support the leaves and the foliage that they put on. So by reducing excess fertilizer use, we reduce excess growth on our plants, and then that in turn reduces the excess amount of water that's required for those plants to be able to survive because of the use of over-fertilization in the landscape. Next, we'll talk about watering with a purpose. We really want you to water slowly so that the water penetrates the ground deeply. We also want to make sure that you're watering infrequently and not every single day. Ideally, what we want to do in our landscape is promote periods of mini droughts between waterings. And when we think about what a mini drought might be, is essentially it's a period between waterings where the soil is going to dry down. And as a result, the roots are going to be encouraged to grow deeper and deeper and deeper into the soil because the soil is not constantly wet right there at the surface. The last thing when watering is we don't want to apply more water to our soil than the soil can actually absorb. You might be surprised on how long it takes water to absorb in our soils to actually get down to the root system. And so we want to make sure that we adjust our watering practices based on the type of soil we have as well. We also want to make sure that we're taking care of our soils and we have a healthy soil that can absorb water. One of the ways that we can improve our soil health is by aerating our soils, especially in our lawns, so that the water and the nutrients that we apply actually can get down deeper into the soil to benefit the roots. There's a lot of things that we can do to promote a good drought-tolerant lawn as well. We can actually increase the mowing height that we set on our mower, and the taller the mowing height, the better the heat and drought tolerance of our turf grass will be as well. Decreasing fertilizer use is also going to help increase drought tolerance, as well as to switching to the warm season turf grasses like buffalo grass, zoysia grass, or Bermuda grass. Those types of grasses are naturally more heat and drought tolerant, and so will do much better in our landscape. And the last tip that we have for drought-proofing your landscape is really to plan ahead. We want to be monitoring for signs of stress in the landscape, and we want to also be prioritizing which plants in the landscape are most important to keep alive. For most of us, that's going to be prioritizing our trees and our shrubs. We also want to consider the economic and environmental costs of losing those plants and the benefits that they provide to the ecosystem. So, for example, the pollinator value of our plants or the shade value that those plants bring to your house or to your property, all of those economic benefits and environmental benefits, we want to make sure that we factor in as we decide which plants to prioritize and water or take care of when resources become scarce.
That's K-State Extension Horticulture Agent for Sedgwick County, Matthew McKernan. As part of the May webinar, he and Central Kansas District Horticulture Agent Jason Graves identified top 10 plants, trees, shrubs, perennial flowers, and annual flowers that are drought tolerant. Their entire presentation is available by searching online for K-State Garden Hour. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman, and this is the K-State Radio Network.